Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. If you're new to our webinar series, thanks for being here. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today, we will be discussing developing effective patient-focused content, writing plain language lay summaries, and SSCP patient sections. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Top Regulatory Service Companies for 2022. So how can we help you? If you have any medical, scientific, or regulatory projects coming up, please reach out to us at consult@Criterion Edge. Our presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And now I will turn it over to you, Lori.
Thank you, Olivia, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. This is our second in a series of 3 about plain language writing. And boy, is there a lot to cover in every single one of these webinars. This is just a huge topic. So I guess that's my disclaimer for the day, is that there's so much content to talk about. Enough to make 10 webinars. So let's just get started with what we're going to try to accomplish today. So today is about doing a deep dive in plain language writing with regards to focusing on patient reports that have a regulatory component. So today, I'll read the content in front of us. Healthcare companies continually strive to communicate important information about their drugs and devices to diverse audiences, patients, caregivers, HCPs, and of course, the general public. So the use of plain language written communication not only has been mandated, but can certainly help ensure key health information and clinical research findings are understandable and accessible to all. So in this second installment, we're going to focus on best practices that guide the development of common form of plain language communication intended for patients, their families, or caregivers. Just as an FYI, our next and final webinar in the series will do the same thing, but it will focus on content intended for HCPs, healthcare providers. But today we're going to be talking about a lay audience, patients of various ages, and their caregivers, and anyone else who's interested. So I've repeated a few slides from my first webinar a few weeks ago, and this is one of them, because I want to, the bottom thing, which it says, content is the user experience, make your words count. I put a couple of slides back in here to remind us of what plain language writing is. And this is one thing I want us all to remember, if we can. The content is the user experience, so the words are important. So the learning objectives today, we're going to focus on a who, what, why, where, a when, and how. Practical strategies you can use to develop effective, patient-centered lay summary content, such as who, identifying the target audience and the details and the demographics of who they are. Why? Why does the audience need to know the information? What are the goals of providing the content? And keep your eye on the goal. Is it for information only? Is it to spur action, or is it to fulfill a regulatory requirement? What format is best suited to support the desired message and the desired goal? how, identify the most appropriate dissemination channels for the information, and any audience accessibility considerations, and finally, when, determine any relevant timing strategies or requirements, such as, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit today, regulatory or in some cases, publication guidelines. So our first goal, I wanted to repeat a couple, as I mentioned, I wanted to repeat a couple of slides from last time. This is one of them. So I'll just let you take it in. Your first goal from Malcolm, this is a quote from Malcolm Gladwell. Your first goal is to be clear and simple, to write at an 8th grade level, but with ideas that are super sophisticated, not easy to do. All good nonfiction writing is about going out and finding someone else and inhabiting their world and representing it to readers. And I thought that was a very eloquent way of saying, think about your audience. What are their needs? What are their abilities and limitations? What's on their mind? And something from Leonardo da Vinci, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. That speaks to that this writing is not easy. And I was looking over some of your questions that you submitted during registration, and there were a few questions that are about that. It's like, how do we do this? How do we take complex concepts and make them understandable to someone in an 8th grade level or possibly lower? So what is plain language? Plain language is writing that's clear, concise, well organized, and follows other best practices appropriate to the subject or field and intended audience. That's a quote from the Plain Writing Act of 2010 in the United States. So this is a bar that we all need to try to meet. Plain language is communication your audience can understand the first time they read it or hear it. That's quite a bar to jump over. And the material is in plain language if after reading the content, your intended audience can find what they need in the content, understand what they find the first time they read it or hear it, and use what they find to meet their needs. Again, these are all high standards. Let's see how we do that. Okay, the key principles of plain language writing, it should adhere to these following principles. Again, this is a little bit of a repeat, but let's just soak it up. Write for your audience, not for you or not for a scientist, but for your audience. Who are you speaking to? Which means you need to know your audience. Who are you speaking to? Organize the information, which may be organized differently than the original source of the information. In the case today, we're going to be talking about plain language summaries of a few different kinds of documents, publications, clinical trial results, and the plain language section of a SSCP. So we're going to get to those in a few minutes. But you can organize your information differently, more clearly in a plain language summary than it was originally, than differently than how it was originally organized. There's no rule that says you can't reorganize the information. Choosing your words carefully, because in plain language writing, word count matters a lot. And so this is one of the challenges of plain language writing. You have to keep your word count down, which leads to the last bullet as being concise. Keep it conversational. That's really true. We're not talking to scientists here. We may be talking to an 80-year-old grandma that needs to understand what happened to her with her hip replacement, for example, or a worried mother of a 2-year-old. So keep it conversational. That's more approachable. Design content presentation. This is a little bit about organization for reading. Unless, of course, it's an audiovisual format such as a TV commercial, but today we're talking about writing in the written, document form. And follow web standards or publication guidelines when applicable, and we will talk about that today. So key attributes, we keep going with this, but let's kind of drill down a little bit more. It needs to be understandable. What does that mean? It needs to be free of jargon, and I would challenge us all to think that we're, as scientific writers, we're full of jargon. And that's how we've been trained to write, and that's how we're expected to write, but not with plain language. You have to drop all of that and find other ways of describing a complex device or procedure or results of a study. Clear and concise, we talked about that. Accuracy, accurately conveys the intent of the message, the original message. And again, there's that keep it conversational. It needs to be neutral. It needs to be factual, balanced, free of bias, and transparent. Non-promotional. There are whole webinars given about how to keep non-promotional language out of plain language summaries and content. Because from a marketing standpoint, many of these documents are used for MSLs and marketing and clinical affairs and medical affairs. And this is a big deal to them to manage to keep it non-promotional. And inclusive, I think we don't think about this. There's genders, nationalities, ethnicities, ages. It goes on and on. Audience specific, again, this is back to who are you talking to? Appropriate reading and comprehension level, and maybe for a particular audience, a very specific audience, it isn't necessarily at the 8th grade or 7th grade level. It could be even lower. Is it relevant? Is the content you're providing relevant to your audience? Are they going to be interested in it? There's also a concept about that all lay summaries and all lay content that is published should be peer reviewed. And or if it's in the case of a plain language summary of an already published article, it should be reviewed by the first author of the original article. So there's a lot of chatter about who's reviewing this content and is it appropriate. So peer reviewed is in this case would be the patient. So do you have patient advocacy groups or other ways that patients can review your plain language before it's published or put out there into the universe? And we're going to talk about this too today, accessibility and discoverability to target audience members. This is also a big hot topic of conversation. Okay, let's dig in. What are the key questions around the core content? So when you have source material, which today, and by the way, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that today we're going to be talking about 3 types of documents that need to be have plain language summaries created for them commonly. And I said it a little earlier, but I'll say it again. That's a summary of safety and clinical performance, the SSCP, of all medical devices that fall under the EU MDR regulations. EU MDR mandates that for some cases, and we'll talk about in a few minutes, for some types of devices, an SSCP is a patient section of the SSCP is required. So the other, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The other document we're going to be talking about is plain language summaries of clinical trial results That also is very driven by the EU. In their the EU CTR, they've got a database called the CTIS, where plain language summarization of clinical trial results can be published and uploaded. And then the third, of course, is plain language summaries of published articles. So that's what we're going to be talking about, those three types of documents. So when you're thinking about this core content and key questions. So including subheadings, so what are the most important details of a story? So do you want to include headings or subheadings or sections? You can do that in plain language writing. You don't have to adhere to the original format necessarily of the document, original document. What do you expect would be the most interesting or relevant information to your audience in that plain language summary? Keep it interesting. What do they want to find out? So would you, for example, utilize quotes if for some types of plain language writing? Would you utilize an infographic? Now, these don't really apply to the three types of plain language writing that I just outlined that we're going to talk about today, but they're not the only type of plain language writing. So keep these kind of core concepts in mind. So what are the required elements to include? This in our registration questions, we got several questions about this. I'm not sure that I can answer it very adequately because the answer is it all depends. But what are the required elements to include? It depends on the plain language content that you're writing. What types of facts, what information, the data. This is a big topic of conversation. So do you find a way to use call out boxes or other types of tricks to be able to get the patient to focus on certain bits of information? That's one method you could use. How do you check for understanding if the bar is to understand that the patient must understand the information the first time they read it or hear it? So think about ways, again, that you might be able to check for understanding in some types of plain language writing. And can the audience use what they find to meet their needs? How do you know that? Again, how do we know that? For some types of plain language content, none of the content we're going to be talking about today, but you could request feedback. You could include a comment box. These are just some ideas of other types of plain language writing, other than the three specific documents we're going to use today to illustrate other concepts about plain language writing. So this is about readability, suitability, and effectiveness. And what is that? Readability and suitability are kind of two twin concepts. So there is a tool, for example, that you can use. I actually just came across this, so some of you may not know about it. It's called the Suitability Assessment of Materials, and that, I think, means written materials. It's a questionnaire that rates written material in 6 areas. So look at those: content, literacy demand. What's the level of literacy that is demanded for the content, the written content? Are there graphics? What's the layout and typography? Learning stimulation and motivation. In other words, how can they learn from it? And cultural appropriateness. Again, this may be useful for a lot of different kinds of plain language writing. It may have less usability for the particular types we're talking about today, but I wanted to get this out there in front of you because I had never heard of it. And it looks pretty interesting. So it might be a tool that you could use either for some of the plain language writing that you're doing, or maybe some of your colleagues are doing. And then what is effective communication? So we talked about that because it's challenging to measure effectiveness. when the types of documents we're going to be talking about today, they just go out into the ether and are posted on websites or published in journal articles, and we never know if they're effective. So there's often no feedback. But if you want to have a conversation with yourself as you are trying to assess the effectiveness, think about the 3 C's, which is, does the content and the writing connect with the intended audience? Is there clarity that can be found? And the cause, the why. Why is the content being put out there in the first place? What gap or need is it supposed to fill in the intended audience? But practically speaking, you can't really assess effectiveness. We don't have the ability to talk to these people afterwards in a lot of different types of plain language writing. It's really tough to do. So let's go to the next slide. So this is, for some of you who may have come to the last webinar, this slide was also in the last webinar when we were talking more globally about plain language writing. And it struck me that it has usefulness today. And besides, I really like the slides, so you're just going to have to bear with me here. In that, I think it captures the large amount of information that's out there and the bombardment for all of these people and targets of this writing. And then this plain language writing, it goes out onto the TV, it's on social media, it goes directly to consumer, it exists on the internet. Today we're talking about it going to patients. And so it also goes to HCPs, caregivers. So I wanted to put this out here to remind you about how massive this is, how many cross currents there are, how complex it is to keep track of all this if you're in charge of this within your organization or you're part of that cross-functional team. And that there's just a lot to think about. And I inserted up at the top right, we're going to tackle this today by using an example device. And it's going to be a class 3 cardiac stent, and I'll do more about that. You'll see that up in the top right. So let's imagine that today, to illustrate plain language writing in a SSCP, in a plain language summary of a published article, and a plain language summary of clinical trial results, let's use a class 3 cardiac stent. Olivia, thank you. So here's the documents we're going to be talking about. Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance, SSCP. This applies only to medical and in vitro devices. And it's required, an SSCP is required for all implantable and class 3 medical devices under Article 32 of the EU MDR. Now that's specifically if those devices have a CE mark in the EU or are seeking CE mark. So the SSCP is very specific to the EU, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It is I think I have a typo there. SSCP is required for class 3 and class, no. Okay, sorry, I'm getting myself confused. I pivoted, that last bullet is pivoting to the EU IVDR, apologies. So in this case, the equivalent of an SSCP document in the medical device space, it is called, in the IVD space, it's called an SSC, an SSP. And in the IVD space, it's required for class C and class D in vitro devices under IVDR. But we're going to talk about, because our sample device today is a medical device, we're going to be talking about SSCPs. Plain language summary, the of a publication is the middle one. And I've given it that abbreviation. There are many abbreviations out, and if you're seeking some of this information, you'll see it yourself out in the published literature. You'll find plain language summaries for publications, and then plain language summaries for clinical trial results, which is the third box. They're given many, many different kinds of names. So today we're going to call a plain language summary for a publication a PLS-P, and that applies to any scientific publication containing information relevant to the patient or the caregivers. So which is many of them. Now, PLS-Ps, just for your consideration, they can be published concurrently with a primary article, or they could be published later. They could be published separately, or they can be published bolted onto or as a part of the original article. And we'll talk a bit about those details. So, and we're going to consider then how it's published, and then considering issues of discoverability of that plain language content and accessibility, and when these plain language summaries of publications can be published. And then lastly, the plain language summary of the clinical trial results. This applies primarily, and for today's purposes, it applies primarily to the clinical trials conducted in the EU or the European Economic Area. Y'all might be familiar with the EU CTR, and this is what is, so that's where we'll focus today. And full compliance with the EU CTR and uploading the PLS for CTRs into their database called CTIS, Clinical Trial Information System. That's being transitioned over the next few years, but it has started already. So this is real. We have to start doing this, and it's going to even ramp up over the next few years. Next slide, I think. Okay, this is me grabbing this because I couldn't resist. It is not mine. I have fully referenced it down the bottom right, and it is small, so I apologize. But it was so great that I wanted to just put it out there for your consideration. It's a side-by-side comparison of a regulatory lay summary, publication-associated plain language summaries, and these standalone published PLS-Ps. So regulatory lay summary, who are the purpose of and the audience for each of those? What is the scope of each? The location, where do they live? And guidelines and criteria. So I'm not going to linger on this because it might be hard for you all to read. Although I can see it pretty well on the screen. It's just really there for your information. I don't think we need to talk about it much, but for your reference later. Okay, let's move on to our first document, which is the SSCP. So the SSCP, Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance for Medical Devices, is intended to provide healthcare workers and relevant patients access to current clinical data and other information about the safety and performance of a medical device. Is there a regulatory requirement to plain language section in an SSCP? Yes, there is. So under the EU MDR, an SSCP must be submitted concurrently with the clinical evaluation report, the CER, the CEP, the plan, to comply with MDR content or MDR requirements. But not all SSCPs, which we'll talk about, require patient sections. And I think the next slide is when we talk about when is that true? So the minimal required content of the SSCP patient section is detailed in MDR regulations. You can go right to that. We're going to talk about that more on the next slide. The manufacturer is encouraged to include additional information to enhance the reader's understanding of the device's safety and performance, which is the entire goal of the SSCP. That what is the device is a summary of the device's safety and clinical performance. And it says here additional details on the purpose, the function, and the relevant regulatory requirements should be included in the SSCP. So here are the key elements. So per MDR requirements, the SSCP must address 9 key elements. It must have the device identification and the manufacturer. It must state the intended purpose, indications, contraindications, and target population. Now there's the SSCP, and then there's the patient section, which is a summarization of the entire SSCP. So what's on the left is what must be in the SSCP, which means that if the SSCP requires a patient section, you have to summarize all of these elements. That's the challenge. So all SSCPs, regardless of the class of the device, must have those elements on the left. Device description, accessories, other devices intended to be used in combination with the device. What are the residual risks, undesirable effects, warnings, and precautions? The summary of the clinical evaluation, activities, and the post-market clinical follow-up. That's a summary of the data. Are there possible other diagnostic or therapeutic alternatives? For those of you familiar with the CER, that speaks more to the state-of-the-art section. And then what is the suggested profile and the training for the user of the device? What are the, of course, applicable harmonized standards, and what's the device revision history? So on the right, you may already be reading that is an example of a plain language section actually taken out of one of our CERs. So I'll just let you kind of consider it for a minute and read through it. And this is only one section, one tiny part of the patient section of an SSCP. So I want to emphasize that if a patient section of the SSCP is required, then it's a separate section. It's bolted onto the SSCP. It has a different heading, so that because the SSCPs are posted to websites, and a patient could go to the section that says a patient section, and they could read it in plain language. I think next slide, So this is plain language summary of publications. I'm calling it a PLSP. There's a lot to talk about here. The plain language summary of a publication is intended to provide healthcare workers, relevant patients, access to plain language summarization of published full-text biomedical journal articles. Now, this applies to any industry, whether it's pharma, biotech, IVD, medical device. This is best practice. It is not, as far as I'm aware, there is no regulatory requirement governing the inclusion of a PLS for a publication. However, Good Publication Practices has updated its guidance recommendations for the PLSP, and look at this, they're very lofty. Goal is that every biomedical publication should have a corresponding PLS, and that PLS for a publication must maintain the same ethical principles as the original published article and should be published in the same journal as the original article, be peer-reviewed, indexed, open access, and fully discoverable. So before we go on to some of those examples, there's a lot packed into that last bullet. It should be peer-reviewed. It should be indexed. It should have open access, and it should be fully discoverable. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the whole point of plain language is that it falls into the right hands. That information falls into the right hands, which are not HCPs, not healthcare providers necessarily. It is for patients, caregivers, mothers, fathers, pediatric, whoever it's aimed at. So those are lofty goals for that GPP is putting out. And I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So various medical writing and publication groups have established recommendations to guide PLS-P content. Free of jargon, free of technical jargon, I would say scientific jargon, just really free of jargon. Unbiased and non-promotional, there are those words again. The recommendations are that these plain language summaries that are part of the publication should be tagged with metadata and keywords or phrases to allow for easy sharing and searchability. They should be short, concise, and written in a sort of an abstract style. And there it is, reviewed by the first author if published, if possible, and indexed in PubMed. So what are you seeing here? You're seeing some themes here. Is that it does the patients or caregivers no use. It's no use to patients or caregivers if they can't find this information. So a lot of these guidelines are focused around make it accessible, give these plain language summaries their own DOI, tag them. They do not need to be published at the same time as a written article. They can be published later. They do not need to be part of a supplement. You know, that ubiquitous supplement to the original article, and lay people don't know what's in a supplement. So again, the information is hidden. They don't necessarily look for something called a supplement to look for this kind of information. So these are all the considerations of plain language summary for publications, and obviously aligns with applicable good publication practices. And I know you have probably already read what's on the right. There's a plain language example from a published article, not one that we've written. And there's the internet is full of these kinds of examples. So you can take that in and see what you think about it. And I know that there were questions out there about, at registration and that are coming in now about how do we manage this? How do we convert complex concepts to plain language? And I'm sure I'll talk about that in the question and answer coming up. Next slide, Olivia. Thank you. Okay, now this is the last document that we're going to review today, and it has a lot of applicability certainly to the other two documents. This is now, in fact, especially the publication document, because often publications are the write-up of the results of phase 3 something or other clinical trial. So they're a kissing cousin, if you will, to the plain language summaries that are going to be uploaded into the CTIS under EU CTR. And so much of the same concepts apply. They're intended for study participants and the general public to have access to research information and results in order to enhance understanding of complex medical information and to increase transparency in clinical research, and to provide healthcare workers and relevant patients access to this plain language summarization of published full text journal articles. So that is, well, it's really the information that would be in a full text journal article, but in this case, it is the clinical trial results themselves, which are not necessarily published in their original form that we might all be used to seeing if we're writing internally, like a clinical study report, those types of things. This is really putting all that into plain language. So as you can see, the applicable guidelines and content are in process, and there is some information about EU CTR 536/2014. Next slide. Here are the Article 37, and if you didn't know this, Article 37 in 536/2014, Annex 5 defines 10 essential content elements to be included in every PLS for clinical trial results. And there they are. I don't need to read them to you. That's pretty standard. And then there's an example of plain language writing for clinical trial results. And this is, oh, by the way, all the examples I've given you are just snippets of the larger document. This is not meant to be the sum total of all the information. Obviously, these plain language summaries, either for publications or for clinical trial results, can be somewhat lengthy, which sort of decreases or increases the challenge to make them accessible to lay people, because the longer they are, you need to deploy subheadings or other types of breaking up called kind of chunking into these documents, into your plain language summaries, to just help the lay reader get through it. We're at our last slide. We can get on to questions next, which is there are consistent themes that we've talked about today: accessibility, transparency, consistency, promotion of patient education and awareness, and certainly accountability. And focusing on the key takeaways for sponsors, which are probably most of you today. Establish coordinated planning activities across multiple internal stakeholder groups. This is a webinar in and of itself, as well as coordinating between clinical science, medical or clinical affairs, KOLs who are putting out journal articles. There's publication plans. So there's a lot of stakeholders, and it's very easy to have them all run off in different directions and do different things, which I know no sponsor, organization, or manufacturer wants that to happen. And I wanted to point out, keep your eye on timing requirements, which every good regulatory person and every good team does. It's like, when do we have to do this? And that's it. Thank you. It's a lot of content. Took a while to get through. Let's get to some questions while we still have some time.
All right, let's go ahead and get to our first question.
How to strike a balance between simplification of information and regulatory compliance? Well, if we're talking about plain language content, whether it be for a CTR, for a plain language, for a publication, or an SSCP, the overriding regulatory compliance is that it's written in plain language. First and foremost, you can't sacrifice the level of plain language readability, suitability, and effectiveness. You can't sacrifice that in order to put in phrases or content or names of things, because you can't, because it's difficult to think of another way to phrase it. So I hope that answers the question, which is the first primary reason is that it is in understandable language. Whatever this plain language content format is, it must adhere to readability, accessibility, and understandability. How you walk the line between words and identifying or explaining difficult concepts is the challenge.
All right, thanks, Lori. Our next question is from Sarah. And her question is, how can the drafting of these documents be organized to meet the regulatory deadlines?
Well, Sarah, if you're thinking about these documents, like the 3 documents we just talked about, I think I sort of just touched on that a little bit. So how can the drafting of these documents be organized to meet the regulatory deadlines? I suspect, Sarah, that you might be alluding to how can we get efficiency out of the writing of the documents, because often it's conceivable that they're being written at the same time or very close to each other. So in that case, this is where a good writing team, or whoever the primary responsible writers are, get together and make a plan and agree on key concepts. How are you going to explain and write up XYZ, some concept that all documents share? So come up with like templated language so that you can use that templated plain language in the SSCP, and then you use it in the plain language summary of a publication if it's applicable, and use it wherever else plain language might show up. So I would say that templated language, key concept language that's in plain language, agree to those might be the first step in organizing and kind of cross-pollinating consistent messaging across 3 disparate documents, but all needing to sort of say the same thing. I hope that helped.
Great, thank you. So we had a couple of questions come through about readability, so I'm going to put them all up for us to take a look at.
We didn't talk about this today. I've talked about it in past, so software recommendations to assess readability, regardless if it's for the SSCP patient section or a plain language summary for another reason. Validating reading levels, plain language, is one instrument or tool better than another to do this. And the answers are likely in another webinar that I did a few weeks ago, where I included more information about this, and very specifically lots of references and links that you can go to look at these types of tools. The short answer is that there is no real recommendation. Like these regulatory authorities don't want to look at one particular type or method, but they do want it assessed. So they haven't drilled down yet saying you must use this method of assessment or you must use that method of assessment. They haven't done that yet. So I think it's up to the manufacturer, the sponsor, to how they want to approach that. But Olivia, can we send folks out, as a follow-up to this, after this webinar, the link to the first webinar that has all those links in it, so they'll have it?
Yes, definitely. And I just also popped the link to that webinar in the chat, and I'll send it out in the email later today.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. All right, our next question is from Trevor. Trevor is asking, do notified bodies demand plain language verification by a proven method?
Well, that's a yes/no question, Trevor, and that's a fairly easy question to answer. In our experience, and we've written now MDR, CERs, we've probably written pushing up to 300. Never. They have not demanded for any of the SSCPs to go with those MDR CERs that have a requirement for a plain language summary. So class 3 implantables, for example, active implantables, those are the two required types of medical devices. They have not. We've done of those, golly, I'm sure done well over 100 of those under MDR. And we've gotten a lot of feedback already. So it's not because we haven't heard from them, the notified bodies. They have not asked for documentation of the methodology to establish plain language in the SSCP.
Okay. Moving on to our next question. This one is from Line. And they're asking how you can have only one SSCP with one part in English and the patient part translated and maintained. So Lori, what would be your advice for this?
One SSCP with the part in English and the patient section. Okay, got it. So in this case, this would be SSCP that would have a patient section, goes with a CER and a CEP, and those documents are uploaded into or submitted to the notified bodies for their approval, and then the competent authorities in the EU then are tasked with distributing patient information written in the local language, if I'm understanding the question correctly, written in the local language. These are the competent authorities now across the EU, for example, in the either in the EU countries or in the economic operator countries. So the question is, do we need to translate the whole SSCP, or can we just translate the patient part into the local language? Full disclosure, I am not a regulatory affairs professional. We're writers, and I'm certainly not part of the competent authority. So the real answer is, I don't know, but I think it's a great and very reasonable question. And I suspect the answer could be that it's a great method. Why would you have to translate more than the patient section of the SSCP for consumption at the local level, which is assuming that those are patients and caregivers? So great question. Sorry, I don't have a definitive answer for you.
All right, do you think we have time for a couple more questions?
I hope so.
Okay. Then let's move on to this next question. This one is from Tatiana. What is an adequate amount of clinical trial information for patients?
Well, I think the nuance here is the addition of the words for patients at the end. So the burden of clinical trial information that's presented in either a published article, in clinical trial results, or in an SSCP, the burden of the adequacy of the clinical trial information, and I suspect also data, the burden falls on the parent document. In other words, the main part of that document, not on the patient section of the document. So the requirement, thinking again about what is the requirement for a patient section of either a published article, clinical trial results are going to be posted in the EU, or an SSCP that requires a patient section. All three of those, they have to look back to all three of those patient-focused content has to look back to and use as its source the original content, the original published article, the actual clinical trial results, the actual SSCP. And it needs somehow then to distill down and put in plain terms the information provided in the original. So maybe if I'm getting to there's an adequate amount of clinical trial information for patients, Maybe this question is also getting to the, is it possible to provide all information to the patients? Is that even possible? This is where the trickiness gets into writing in plain language. You're really writing about concepts, results, overarching large themes, big statements, because those are the simplest. So, and that's where the trickiness comes in. How can you distill down in 1 or 2 sentences complex findings? And thus, I guess, get to this question, is that adequate? And that's the challenge. And right now, I don't know that adequacy is being measured by, let's just say, a notified body or by any regulatory authority for that matter. So there's that concept as well. Who's checking on this, really? Who's checking? And is there a demand? And what if it doesn't meet that demand? Do we have to rewrite it? I think those are unanswered questions. One more, Olivia.
All right, we can do one more. Well, these 2 questions were pretty similar, so I will put them up together. These questions were sent in from Lindsay and Ben. What are the best ways to approach the design of this content to also engage the audience? And what is the process to best determine the format?
Well, for a patient section of an SSCP, that format is rather dictated. So how can you use, so there's that. For patient language, plain language summaries of clinical trial results that are to be uploaded into the CTIS, also rather dictated. And then for plain language summaries in the published world, less dictated about what that format is, unless it's dictated by the publisher themselves. So there's the design of the content has to do with basic core concepts of plain language accessibility, using that chunking I talked about, subheadings, even infographics if it's allowed for whatever the destination of this plain language content is. These call-out boxes, some of that stuff that I talked about earlier. But if not, bullet points are handy. Subheadings are handy. Short sentences are good. Breaking up in paragraphs. So that if it's just writing and you don't have the ability to put in infographics or other types of, or do something with your font or other types of tricks and methodologies, I think mostly it's going to be paragraphs, subheadings, clearly written so that the patient or caregiver can follow along clearly.
All right, thanks, Lori. We are out of time. Thank you again, Lori, for your presentation today, and everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks again.